Picture this. Your husband of 23 years disappears every Tuesday and Thursday evening, claiming overtime at the office. You trust him completely until you discover he's been paying rent on a secret apartment downtown, where he meets his younger girlfriend. The betrayal cuts deep enough, but then she has the audacity to show up at your front door, drink your wine and call you pathetic to your face while explaining how she's stealing your husband because you've let yourself go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Most women would crumble. Most women would accept the scraps their cheating husbands offered and quietly fade into the background of their own lives. But what happens when that pathetic housewife turns out to own every single property where their affair has been unfolding? What happens when the woman they thought was powerless holds all the cards they never knew existed? Sometimes the mouse you think you're playing with turns out to be the cat who's been watching you the entire time. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in my carefully constructed life. I was standing at the kitchen counter, sorting through David's dress shirts for the dry cleaner, when my fingers brushed against something unexpected in his breast pocket. A small piece of paper, folded twice and warm from being close to his body for who knows how long. I almost threw it away without looking. After 23 years of marriage, you develop habits that keep life running smoothly. You don't snoop through pockets looking for trouble. You trust that the man who kisses you goodbye every morning and tells you he loves you is telling the truth. You believe that the person you built a life with wouldn't systematically destroy everything you've worked for together. But something about the way the paper felt in my fingers made me pause. It wasn't a business card or a receipt from the gas station near his office. It was softer, more personal somehow. Against every instinct I'd developed as a trusting wife, I unfolded it. Romano's Italian Bistro. Table for Tuesday, March 15th. Total 147.83. The date hit me like a physical blow. Last Tuesday, the night I'd been home with food poisoning, barely able to keep crackers down, while David claimed he was working late on the Henderson account. I remembered lying on the couch in my pajamas, texting him around 9 p.m. to ask if he'd eaten dinner. His response had been immediate. Just grabbing something quick at the office. Home soon. But this receipt told a different story. Champagne. 2 appetizers. Osso buco for tiramisu and coffee. The timestamp showed 8:47 p.m. Exactly when he'd been texting me about eating alone at his desk. My hands were trembling as I held the evidence of what felt impossible. David worked 60-hour weeks to support our comfortable suburban lifestyle. He coached Little League on weekends when the season was active. He held my hand during movies and brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning. The man described by this receipt, the man who ordered expensive wine and shared dessert with someone who wasn't his wife, seemed like a stranger wearing my husband's clothes. I stood there in our pristine kitchen, surrounded by the life we'd built together, and felt the first crack appear in the foundation of everything I thought I knew. The receipt smelled faintly of perfume that definitely wasn't mine. Something floral and expensive that seemed to mock my sensible lavender soap and drugstore moisturizer. Catherine, I told myself, there has to be an explanation. Maybe he took a client out for dinner. Maybe it was a business meeting that ran late. Maybe the perfume smell came from sitting next to someone at the restaurant. Maybe. But even as I tried to rationalize away the growing knot in my stomach, I knew I was lying to myself. In 23 years of marriage, David had never once taken a client to Romano. He always said it was too romantic for business meetings, too intimate for professional relationships. It was the place he'd taken me for our anniversary dinners back when we still celebrated such things with elaborate gestures and expensive wine. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, the familiar rhythm of his morning routine. Shower, shave, dress, coffee, kiss goodbye. The same pattern we'd followed for over 2 decades. But this morning, everything felt different. The receipt in my hand felt like holding dynamite, dangerous and explosive and capable of destroying everything in its vicinity. Morning, beautiful, David said as he entered the kitchen, straightening his tie with practiced efficiency. He looked exactly like the man I'd married. Still handsome at 47, silver threading through his dark hair in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. His smile was the same one that had made me fall in love with him in college, warm and genuine and completely focused on me. For a moment I almost folded the receipt back up and slipped it into my pocket. Almost pretended I'd never found it. Almost chose the comfortable lie over the devastating truth. Instead I held it out to him. David, what's that? His eyes flicked to the paper in my hand, and I watched his face change. Not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious to a stranger, but I'd been studying his expressions for 23 years. The slight tightening around his eye, the almost imperceptible pause before he reached for his coffee mug, the way his jaw tensed just enough to be noticeable. "A receipt," he said, taking the paper from my hand. "Looks like from Romano's. I know where it's from. I want to know who you had dinner with last Tuesday night." David set down his coffee mug with the careful precision of someone buying time to think. "Client dinner. You remember I told you I had that late meeting. Which client orders champagne and shares tiramisu?" The question hung between us in the sudden silence of our kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, our neighbor started his car for his own commute to his own job. His own ordinary life that probably wasn't built on lies. David finally looked at me directly, and what I saw in his eyes confirmed what my heart already knew. Not guilt exactly, but calculation. He was weighing his options, deciding how much truth he could get away with revealing. "Catherine, I don't like your tone." The deflection was so immediate, so perfectly executed, that I almost apologized, almost fell back into the familiar pattern of smoothing over tension, of being the peacekeeper in our marriage. But something about finding that receipt had shifted something fundamental inside me. My tone, I kept my voice level. "David, you lied to me. You told me you were working late, but you were at Romano's with someone else. It was business, Catherine. Sometimes client dinners require a certain atmosphere." "What client?" Another pause, another calculation. "The Morrison account. You know how demanding they are about presentation." I'd never heard of the Morrison account. In 23 years of marriage, David had always shared stories about his work, complaining about difficult clients and celebrating successful deals. He was a commercial real estate broker, and his world was full of colorful characters and dramatic negotiations that he loved recounting over dinner. But Morrison was a new name. "Tell me about them," I said. David picked up his briefcase, suddenly urgent about getting to the office. "I'm running late, Catherine. Can we discuss this tonight?" "We can discuss it right now." Something in my voice must have convinced him that I wasn't going to let this drop, because he set down his briefcase and faced me full. When he did, I saw something I'd never seen before in 23 years of marriage. My husband was looking at me like I was an obstacle to be managed rather than a partner to be trusted. "The Morrison account is complicated," he said. "High-stakes commercial development. The kind of client who expects to be treated with a certain level of sophistication. So you took Morrison to our anniversary restaurant." "It's not our anniversary restaurant, Catherine. It's just a restaurant." The casual dismissal of what I'd considered a meaningful place in our relationship stung more than I expected. Romano's was where he'd proposed, where we'd celebrated promotions and anniversaries and special occasions for over 20 years. But apparently it was just a restaurant to him now. Did Morrison enjoy the tiramisu? David's jaw tightened. "What exactly are you trying to imply?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking direct questions that you keep avoiding." He checked his watch, a gesture I'd seen thousands of times but which now felt like theater. "I really do have to. Mr. Morrison is expecting a call first thing. And this deal is worth more than you realize." I watched him gather his things, kiss my cheek with the same perfunctory affection he'd shown for months, and head toward the garage. But just before he reached the door, I called out to him, "Dave, what does Morrison look like?" He paused with his hand on the doorknob. "What kind of question is that?" "Just curious. Tall, short, old, young?" For the first time that morning, David's composure cracked completely. The pause stretched too long. His breathing became slightly labored, and when he finally answered, his voice sounded strained. "Medium height, middle-aged, professional appearance." He or she? The silence that followed my question was deafening. In all our years together, I'd never seen David struggle so obviously to answer such a simple question. His face went through a series of micro-expressions that would have been almost comical if they weren't confirming my worst fears. David finally said, "Mr. Morris," but we both knew he was lying. After he left, I stood in our empty kitchen holding the receipt that had started everything, and made a decision that would change the rest of my life. I was going to find out who Morrison really was. I started with his office, calling the main number and asking to speak with David about the Morrison account. His secretary, Linda, was chatty and helpful in the way that people are when they have no reason to be suspicious. "Oh, Miss Patterson isn't handling any Morrison accounts right now," she said cheerfully. "Did you want me to connect you with someone else who might be working with them?" "No, that's okay." I must have misunderstood, but I hadn't misunderstood anything. David had just lied to my face about a client that didn't exist, using a story he'd invented to explain why he'd been having romantic dinners while I was homesick. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of mundane activities that felt surreal, given what I'd discovered. I did laundry, paid bills, planned dinner for a husband who was lying to me about where he spent his evenings. Every normal task felt like performance art, like I was playing the role of the unsuspecting wife while my real self was screaming somewhere deep inside. Around noon, I found myself doing something I'd never done before in our entire marriage. I opened David's laptop. He'd left it on the kitchen counter, plugged in and sleeping but not password protected. David had always been casual about security, trusting that our home was a safe space where privacy meant something different than it did in the outside world. His email was open, displaying the usual mix of work correspondence and promotional messages. I scrolled through looking for anything related to Morrison, but found nothing. Then I opened his calendar. Tuesday, March 15th, 7:00 p.m. Dinner meeting, no client name, no location, just dinner meeting, in the carefully neutral language of someone who was being deliberately vague. I scrolled back through previous weeks, looking for patterns. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 3 months showed the same entry: dinner meeting. Sometimes there were variations: late meeting, client dinner, development consultation, but never any names, never any specific, and never any record of the actual business that was supposedly being conducted.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
My hands were shaking as I opened his browser history. If David was having an affair, there would be evidence somewhere. Dating sites, maybe, or Google searches for restaurants and hotels. Something that would prove what I was beginning to understand was true. What I found was worse than anything I'd imagined. Apartment listings, specifically furnished apartments downtown. David had been researching short-term rentals in the most expensive part of the city, looking at places with monthly rates that cost more than our mortgage payment. One listing was bookmarked: a one-bedroom furnished apartment on Maple Street, with floor-to-ceiling windows, modern appliances, in what the description called the perfect space for a romantic getaway. The monthly rent was... I clicked on the listing and felt something cold settle in my chest as I looked at the photos. Exposed brick walls, a king-sized bed with expensive linens, a kitchen stocked with wine glasses and champagne flute. It was beautiful, intimate, and designed specifically for the kind of relationship David was apparently having with someone who wasn't his wife. The listing had been viewed repeatedly over the past month, always on David's computer, always during times when he was supposedly at work. I closed the laptop and sat in the sudden quiet of our house, trying to process what I'd learned. My husband wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to set up a love nest downtown, a place where he could conduct his relationship in comfort and privacy while I waited at home for him to come back from his fictional client meetings. The betrayal was comprehensive, methodical, and this wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake that had spiraled out of control. This was a deliberate construction of a secret life that required significant time, money, and emotional energy to maintain. I thought about the woman at Romano's, whoever she was, sharing champagne and dessert with my husband while I was home with food poisoning. She was probably helping him pick out apartments where they could play house while I managed the real house that we'd built together over 23 years. And the most devastating part was that I had no idea how long it had been going on, or how much of our recent life together had been an elaborate performance for my benefit. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I drove downtown to Maple Street and parked across from the building David had bookmarked. It was exactly as luxurious as the photos had suggested, with a doorman and valet parking, in the kind of understated elegance that cost serious money to maintain. I sat in my car for 2 hours, watching the building and trying to imagine my husband walking through those doors with another woman, trying to picture him holding her hand in the elevator, unlocking the door to their secret apartment, pouring champagne into glasses he'd probably bought specifically for their romantic evenings together. At 4:30 p.m., I saw David's car pull into the valet area. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him get out, straighten his tie, and walk toward the building's entrance like he belonged there, like he was coming home to a life he'd built with someone else. 15 minutes later, a woman emerged from a taxi at the same entrance. She was younger than me by at least 15 years, with the kind of effortless blonde beauty that comes from expensive salons and regular personal training sessions. She wore a dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 3 months, and she walked with the confidence of someone who was absolutely certain of her welcome. I watched her disappear into the building, and knew with complete certainty that she was Morris. She was the client who required champagne and intimate restaurants. She was the reason David had been researching love nests and lying about his schedule. She was the woman who was about to destroy my marriage, and she had no idea that I was sitting across the street, watching her walk into what she probably thought was her secret paradise with my husband. But what she really didn't know, what David didn't know, and what I was only beginning to understand myself, was that some secrets are more dangerous to the people keeping them than to the people they're kept from. And sometimes the woman you think is pathetic turns out to be the one holding all the power you never knew existed. I drove home from Maple Street in a daze, my mind reeling from what I'd witnessed. The woman in the expensive dress, David's casual confidence as he walked into that building like he owned it, the reality that my husband had been living a double life for months while I remained completely oblivious. By the time I pulled into our driveway, something had fundamentally shifted inside me. The shock was giving way to something harder, more focused. I wasn't just the betrayed wife anymore. I was someone who needed answers, and I was going to get. That evening, David came home at his usual time, carrying the scent of expensive cologne that I didn't recognize. He kissed my cheek with the same distracted affection he'd shown for months, asked about my day with the polite interest of someone making conversation with a stranger. How was work? I asked as we sat down to the dinner I'd prepared while my world was falling apart. Busy day, the Morrison account is getting more complex by the hour. The lie rolled off his tongue so effortlessly that I almost admired the skill involved. Here was a man who could look his wife of 23 years in the eye and fabricate entire business relationships without so much as a tremor in his voice. Tell me more about Morrison, I said, cutting into my chicken with deliberate precision. What kind of development are they working on? David's fork paused halfway to his mouth, just for a second. Mixed-use commercial project. Very high-end. Morrison has specific ideas about luxury markets. Sounds like someone with expensive taste. Very expensive. Morrison appreciates quality over economy in everything. The irony was breathtaking. David was essentially describing his affair to me, using the fictional client as cover for discussing the woman he was sleeping with behind my back. Morrison appreciated quality, just like the blonde in the designer dress. Morrison had expensive taste, just like someone who would choose a $2,800 per month apartment for romantic liaisons. I spent the next 3 days conducting my own investigation while David continued his charade of working late and dealing with demanding clients. I followed him twice more to the Maple Street building, each time watching him meet the same woman, each time feeling more detached from the life we'd supposedly been sharing. On Friday afternoon, I made a phone call that would change everything. Patterson Holdings. This is Helen Mitchell speaking. Patterson Holdings. I'd almost forgotten about my father's real estate investment company, the one I'd inherited 5 years ago when he passed away. Helen had been managing it so efficiently that I rarely thought about the monthly reports or the properties scattered throughout the city. It generated steady income that went directly into our joint accounts, money I'd always assumed David was aware of but had never paid much attention to myself. Helen, this is Catherine. I need to ask you about our property portfolio. Of course. Is there something specific you'd like to know? Do we own any buildings on Maple Street? The pause on Helen's end was brief but telling. Actually, yes. The Meridian building at Fort. Beautiful property, fully leased, excellent tenants. Why do you ask? My heart started beating faster. Can you send me the tenant list for that building? Absolutely. I'll email it right over. Catherine, is everything all right? You sound a bit stressed. Just curious about our investment. I realize I haven't been paying enough attention to the business. While I waited for Helen's email, I sat in my home office, surrounded by the comfortable life David and I had built together, and tried to process what might be happening. If Patterson Holdings owned the building where David was conducting his affair, if my inheritance was somehow connected to his betrayal, then this situation was more complicated than I'd imagined. Helen's email arrived within the hour, and I opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. The Meridian building tenant list was exactly what I expected from an upscale downtown property. Law firms, consulting companies, a few high-end residential units for executives who wanted city living without the commitment of ownership. And there, listed under residential tenants for Unit 15B, was a name that made my blood run cold. David M. Patterson. My husband was renting an apartment from me. The love nest where he was conducting his affair was being paid for with money that ultimately came back to our joint accounts, because I owned the building he was using to cheat on me. The elegant brutality of the situation was almost artistic. David had been stealing from our marriage to pay for an apartment that I owned, funding his betrayal with money that was partially mine to begin with, conducting his affair on property that would revert to me in any divorce settlement. I called Helen back immediately. Helen, I need all the documentation for Unit 15B at the Meridian building. Lease agreements, payment history, everything. That's the unit leased to David Patterson. Same last name as you, interesting coincidence. Though I have to tell you, he's been problematic. Late payments, complaints from neighbors about noise, and now he's 3 months behind on rent. 3 months behind, $8,400 in arrears, plus late fees. I was going to start eviction proceedings next week unless he catches up. Do you want me to hold off on that? I closed my eyes and tried to calculate what this meant. David had been taking money from our accounts to pay for the apartment, but apparently not enough money to actually cover the rent. He was funding his affair poorly, defaulting on payments to his own wife's company while probably telling his mistress that money was no object. Helen, I want you to send me copies of every communication we've had with David Patterson, every late notice, every payment reminder, every lease violation. Catherine, what's going on? You seem very focused on this particular tenant. I'll explain later. Right now, I just need the documentation. After hanging up, I spread David's lease documents across my desk and tried to understand the scope of his deception. He'd signed a 1-year lease, 8 months ago, around the time his Tuesday and Thursday evening client meetings had started. The lease was in his name only, with no mention of additional occupants, which meant he was also violating the terms of occupancy by having his mistress stay there regularly. The rental application was a masterpiece of selective truth-telling. David had listed his employment accurately, provided our home address as his residence, and included our joint bank account information for the financial verification. He'd essentially used our marriage as collateral to secure an apartment where he could betray that same marriage. But the most revealing detail was at the bottom of the application, where he'd listed an emergency contact, Morrison, with a phone number I didn't recognize. Morrison wasn't a fictional client. Morrison was his girlfriend's name, or at least the name she was using on official documents. And she'd been part of this deception from the very beginning. Trusted enough to be listed as David's emergency contact for the apartment where they conducted their affair. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. It rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered. Vanessa Monroe. Vanessa, this is Catherine Patterson. I think we need to talk. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled but with an undercurrent of tension. I don't know anyone named Catherine Patterson. You know my husband, David Patterson. The man you've been meeting at the apartment on Maple Street. Another long pause. When Vanessa spoke again, the pretense was gone. What do you want? I want to understand what you think you're doing with my husband. What I think I'm doing. Her voice shifted from nervous to defensive. Lady, I don't know what David's told you, but this isn't what you think it is. Then explain it to me. David and I are in love. We've been together for 8 months, and we're planning a future together. He's been trying to find a way to end things with you without causing unnecessary drama. The casual cruelty of her words was breathtaking. Unnecessary drama. As if 23 years of marriage was just an inconvenience to be managed rather than a relationship that deserved honesty and respect. Without causing unnecessary drama. I kept my voice level. Is that what he calls lying about client meetings and hiding an apartment downtown? David's trying to protect everyone involved. He knows this situation is complicated, but he's handling it the best way he can. By lying to both of us. He's not lying to me. I almost laughed at her certainty. Vanessa, has David told you he's 3 months behind on rent for your love nest? The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. That's impossible, she said, but her voice had lost its confidence. David handles all the expenses. He's been taking care of everything. The apartment management company has been sending him late notices for 12 weeks. He owes $8,400 in back rent, and they're starting eviction proceedings next week. You're lying. I can send you copies of the documentation if you'd like. Another silence, longer this time. When Vanessa spoke again, her voice had changed completely. The defensive confidence was gone, replaced by something sharper and more calculating. Who are you exactly, and how do you have access to David's rental information? This was the moment I'd been building toward without realizing it. The moment when I could reveal the scope of what David and his mistress didn't understand about the situation they'd created. I'm his wife, Vanessa, but more importantly for your situation, I'm also his landlord. The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a gasp and a choke. That's impossible. Patterson Holdings owns the Meridian building. Every month that David makes a rent payment, he's paying money to a company I inherited from my father. Every month that he doesn't make a rent payment, he's stealing from a business that belongs to me. Vanessa didn't respond immediately, and I could almost hear her mind working, trying to process the implications of what I'd just revealed. David told me he owned the apartment, she said finally, her voice small. He said it was an investment property he'd bought for us to build equity together. David doesn't own anything except half of our jointly held assets and a car that's still being financed. The apartment where you've been playing house belongs to me, and your boyfriend has been defaulting on the rent payments. The silence stretched until I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. This can't be happening. It gets worse, Vanessa. Would you like to meet in person, so I can show you exactly how much trouble you're both in? 2 hours later, I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown, watching Vanessa Monroe walk through the door with the expression of someone heading to their own execution. She was even more beautiful in person than she'd been from a distance, but there was something brittle about her composure that suggested she wasn't handling our phone conversation well. She sat down across from me without ordering anything, her designer handbag clutched in her lap like armor. You wanted to meet, she said. Talk. I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, filled with lease documents, late payment notices, and property ownership records. Let's start with what David's told you about his situation. We're in love. He's been trying to leave you for months, but you've been making it difficult. Something about being vindictive about property settlements. I almost admired the elegance of David's lie. He'd painted me as the obstacle to their happiness, the vindictive wife who was being unreasonable about dividing assets I was apparently too stupid to understand. What else? He owns the apartment where we stay. He bought it as an investment when he realized his marriage was. He's been supporting both households until the divorce is finalized, which is why things have been financially tight lately. And you believed all of this? Vanessa's jaw tightened. David's never given me any reason to doubt him. I opened the folder and pushed the lease agreement across the table. This is David's rental agreement for Unit 15B. Notice that he's listed as a tenant, not an owner. Notice the monthly rent amount. Notice your name listed as his emergency contact. She read the document with growing confusion, her perfect composure cracking with each detail that contradicted David's story. I don't understand. If he's renting it, then who owns it? I placed the property deed on the table next to the lease. Patterson Holdings. My company. I own the building where you've been having your affair. The color drained from Vanessa's face as she stared at the paperwork. This is some kind of mistake. No mistake. David has been paying rent to my company for 8 months. Or rather, he's been supposed to pay. These are the late payment notices. I spread out 3 months' worth of increasingly urgent notices from the property management company, each one demanding payment of overdue rent, each one threatening legal action if the tenant didn't bring the account current immediately. But David told me money was tight because he was supporting 2 households. He said you were being expensive and demanding about your needs. The picture that emerged from Vanessa's words was so different from reality that I had to admire David's creativity. He'd convinced his mistress that I was the financial burden making their relationship difficult, when in fact he was stealing from both of us to fund an affair he couldn't actually afford. Vanessa, David makes $127,000 a year in base salary, plus commission. Our mortgage payment is $2,800 a month. We have no children at home, minimal debt, and a comfortable but not extravagant lifestyle. The only financial strain in our marriage is the money he's been spending on you. She stared at the document spread across our table, her breathing becoming slightly labored. But he said you were demanding alimony, and half his pension, and trying to keep the house that was too expensive for him to maintain on his own. We haven't discussed divorce, Vanessa. Until 4 days ago I had no idea David was having an affair. The words hit her like a physical blow. I watched her process the implications, watched her realize that every conversation she'd had with David about their future together had been based on lies he was telling both of us. If you didn't know about me, she said slowly, then what David told me about you agreeing to separate wasn't true. David hasn't asked for a separation. He hasn't mentioned being unhappy with our marriage. He's been living a completely normal life at home, while conducting a completely separate life with you. Vanessa put her head in her hands. I'm going to be sick. I waited while she processed everything, watching this beautiful, confident woman, realize that she'd been as deceived as I had been. David hadn't just been cheating on me with her. He'd been cheating on her with me, maintaining two relationships by lying to both of us about the other. There's more, I said gently. She looked up with eyes that already looked defeated. More. I pulled out my phone and opened the Patterson Holdings portfolio app that Helen had installed for me years ago. This is my company's property portfolio. We own 12 commercial and residential buildings in the city, worth approximately $7 million total. I scrolled through the listings, showing her the coffee shop where we were sitting, the office building where David worked, the shopping center where she'd probably bought the designer dress she was wearing. Patterson Holdings has been generating between $40,000 and $50,000 per month in rental income for the past 3 years. That money goes into accounts that David has access to as my spouse. Vanessa stared at my phone screen. You're rich. I'm comfortable. But more importantly, I own most of the places where you and David have been conducting your relationship. The restaurant where he took you for your first date. The parking garage where you meet before going to the apartment. The jewelry store where he bought you that necklace you're wearing. She touched the pendant at her throat unconsciously. David said he was stretched thin financially. He said he was making sacrifices to afford nice things for both of us while he sorted out his situation. David's been using income from my properties to fund your relationship, while defaulting on the rent for the apartment where that relationship takes place. He's been stealing from me to pay for dates with you, then lying to you about why money is tight. The full scope of David's deception was finally becoming clear to both of us. He hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd constructed an elaborate financial shell game that involved stealing from me, lying to her, and creating a completely false narrative about his circumstances that allowed him to play the hero in both relationships. Vanessa was quiet for a long time, staring at the evidence spread across our table. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, harder. What happens now? That depends on what you want to happen. She looked at me directly for the first time since she'd arrived. What I want is to understand why you asked me to meet with you. If I were in your situation, I'd be screaming at the other woman, not showing her financial documents. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since I'd made the phone call. Why wasn't I furious with her? Why wasn't I treating her as the enemy who'd stolen my husband? Because you're not the other woman, Vanessa, you're another victim. The words surprised both of us. David told you his marriage was over, I continued. He told you I was being vindictive and expensive and difficult. He convinced you that you were helping him escape an unhappy situation, not that you were helping him betray a wife who thought everything was fine. Tears started forming in her eyes, the first crack in her composure since she'd arrived. He told me you were basically roommates at this point, that you'd grown apart and were just going through the motions, until he could figure out how to leave without destroying you financially. What else did he tell you about me? That you'd let yourself go, that you were depressed and unmotivated, and had given up on being a real partner to him. She wiped her eyes, smearing her expensive mascara. He said you were pathetic. The word hit me like a slap, but not because it hurt, because it revealed something fundamental about how David saw both of us. I was pathetic because I trusted him. She was useful because she believed. Neither of us was actually a person to him. We were just resources to be managed in service of what he wanted. Do you want to know what I think, Vanessa? She nodded. I think David found someone beautiful and intelligent and successful, and he decided he wanted that life. But he didn't want to give up the security and comfort of his marriage to get it. So he invented a story that allowed him to have both. But why lie to me about the money? Why make it seem like he was struggling when he apparently has access to all this? She gestured at my phone, still displaying the property portfolio. Because if you knew he was wealthy, you might expect him to leave his wife immediately. The story about financial complications bought him time to have his cake and eat it too. Vanessa stared at me across the table, and I could see her rewriting every conversation she'd had with David over the past 8 months. He's never going to leave you, is he? Not voluntarily. This setup is too convenient for him. She was quiet for several minutes, thinking through implications I probably couldn't even imagine. Finally, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. What do you want from me, Catherine? Why are we really here? I'd been asking myself the same question since I'd suggested this meeting. Why had I called his mistress instead of confronting David directly? Why was I sitting in a coffee shop showing financial documents to the woman who'd been sleeping with my husband instead of talking to a divorce lawyer? I want to understand what David's been telling both of us, I said, and I want you to understand that the man you think you're in love with doesn't actually exist. And then what? Then we decide what we want to do about it. The look that passed between us was charged with possibility. Two women who'd been manipulated by the same man, who'd both been lied to and used and treated as objects in David's carefully constructed fantasy life. "What are you thinking?" Vanessa asked. I smiled for the first time in days. "I'm thinking that David has no idea who he's dealing with. Either of us. That evening, David came home from work at his usual time, carrying Chinese takeout and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who thought his complicated life was running smooth. He had no idea that his wife and his mistress had spent the afternoon comparing notes and discovering the scope of his deception. "How was your day?" he asked, kissing my cheek with the casual affection of someone who thought he was safe. "Interesting," I said. "I met someone new." "Anyone I know?" I looked at my husband of 23 years, this man who'd been living a double life with such skill and confidence, and realized that for the first time since I'd found that receipt in his pocket, I felt like I had the advantage. "Actually, yes, I think you know her quite well." Something in my tone must have alerted him to danger, because David's expression shifted from casual interest to wary attention. "What do you mean?" "I met Vanessa Monroe today. She's lovely. We had coffee and discussed your relationship with both of us." The container of Chinese food slipped from David's hands and hit the floor, sending lo mein noodles across our kitchen tiles. His face went through a series of expressions so rapidly that I almost felt sorry for him. "Almost. Catherine, I can explain. I'm sure you've been explaining things very creatively for months." David bent to clean up the spilled food, his hands shaking enough that I could see the tremor from across the room. When he stood up, his face had gone pale. "What did she tell you?" "Everything, David. About the apartment I own that you're renting. About the lies you've been telling both of us. About how you convinced her I was pathetic and vindictive, while convincing me that she didn't exist." He leaned against the counter, looking like a man who'd just realized his house of cards was collapsing. "Catherine, none of this was supposed to happen the way it did." "How was it supposed to happen?" "I was going to tell you. I was trying to find the right time, the right way to explain that we'd grown apart and needed to make changes. When? After you'd stolen enough of my rental income to afford your double life indefinitely." David's eyes wide. "Your rental income?" "Patterson Holdings, Dave. The company I inherited from my father. The company that owns the building where you've been conducting your affair and defaulting on rent payment." I watched him process this information, watched him realize that his carefully constructed deception had been funded by money that ultimately belonged to me. "You knew about the apartment?" "I know about everything. The fake client meetings, the Morrison account that doesn't exist, the lease you signed using our marriage as financial collateral to secure a place where you could betray that marriage." David sat down heavily at our kitchen table, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "What happens now? That depends on you, Dave. What exactly did you think was going to happen? Did you really believe you could maintain two relationships indefinitely, by lying to both of us?" "I thought I could figure out how to handle the situation without destroying anyone's life. Instead, you've been destroying two lives by trying to avoid making a choice." He looked at me with something that might have been regret, but more likely was just self-pity at being caught. "Catherine, I never meant for you to find out this way." "How did you mean for me to find out? Were you planning to tell me after you'd moved in with Vanessa permanently? After you'd figured out how to take half of everything we'd built together to fund your new life with her?" "It's not like that." "Then what is it like, David? Explain to me what your plan was." He was quiet for a long time, staring at the Chinese food stains on our floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I don't know. I just wanted to be happy." "At whose expense?" "I thought I could make everyone happy. I thought if I was careful enough, patient enough, I could figure out how to transition from one life to another without anyone getting hurt." I stared at this man I'd been married to for 23 years, and realized I was looking at a stranger. Not because he'd changed, but because I was finally seeing him clearly for the first time. "David, do you understand that you've been stealing from me to pay for an affair with a woman you've been lying to about our marriage?" "I wasn't stealing. We're married. What's mine is yours when we're building a life together, not when you're using my assets to build a life with someone else." He finally looked at me directly, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't guilt or remorse. It was calculation. He was trying to figure out how to manage this situation, how to minimize the damage to himself. "What do you want, Catherine?" "I want you to understand that the woman you called pathetic owns the building where you've been playing house. I want you to understand that your girlfriend knows you've been lying to both of us. And I want you to understand that your comfortable little deception is over." "Are you filing for divorce?" "I don't know yet. First, I'm going to see what kind of man you really are when you can't lie your way out of consequences." David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and I saw his face go even paler. "That's Vanessa, isn't it?" He nodded. "What does she want?" I smiled, remembering the look in Vanessa's eyes when she'd left our coffee meeting earlier that afternoon. The anger, the hurt, and underneath it all, the calculation of someone who'd realized she'd been played. I think you should take her call, David. I think you two have a lot to discuss. As he walked into his office to deal with the crisis I'd created by introducing his two victims to each other, I stood in our kitchen and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Power. For the first time since finding that receipt, I wasn't the confused, betrayed wife trying to understand what had happened to her marriage. I was the woman who owned the building where David conducted his affair, who controlled access to the income he'd been stealing, who'd just introduced his carefully separated worlds to each other. David thought he'd been playing both of us, but it turned out we were about to start playing him. And unlike David, Vanessa and I weren't planning to lie about our intentions. The next 3 days were a master class in watching someone's carefully constructed deception collapse in real time. David's phone rang constantly with calls from Vanessa that he answered in increasingly panicked whispers behind closed doors. He forgot to eat dinner, barely slept, and jumped every time the doorbell rang or a car pulled into our driveway. I, meanwhile, had never felt calmer. Helen Mitchell called on Thursday morning with an update about the Meridian building situation. Catherine, I hate to bother you about this tenant issue again, but David Patterson's rent is now 4 months overdue. The total amount owed is $11,200 with late fees. And frankly, we need to either collect payment or begin eviction proceedings immediately. What does eviction proceedings involve? 30-day notice to vacate, and if he doesn't comply, we go through the courts to have him legally removed from the property. With the amount he owes, we could also pursue civil action for the debt. I thought about David, somewhere in the house having another hushed conversation with Vanessa, probably trying to convince her that his wife's ownership of their love nest was somehow a coincidence he could explain away. Helen, let's start the eviction process. Are you sure? It can be messy, and with his last name being Patterson, there might be some confusion about your involvement. I'm very sure. Send him the 30-day notice today. Will do. And Catherine, I hope you don't mind my asking, but you seem much more engaged with the business lately. I'm glad to see you taking an active interest in your inheritance. After hanging up, I realized Helen was right. For 5 years, I'd let her manage Patterson Holdings while I focused on being David's wife, maintaining our household, and living the comfortable but unremarkable life we'd built together. I'd inherited a multi-million-dollar business and treated it like a hobby that paid for vacations and home improvements. But now, for the first time, I understood the power that came with owning property. Real power, the kind of power that could change lives and force consequences, and make people who thought they were untouchable realize they were completely vulnerable. David found me in the kitchen that afternoon, holding an official-looking envelope with the return address of Chen Property Management. Catherine, what is this? I glanced at the envelope. Looks like mail addressed to you. It's an eviction notice for the apartment on Maple Street. Oh, that? Yes, I instructed Helen to begin eviction proceedings for any tenant who's more than 90 days behind on rent. David stared at me like I'd grown a second head. You can't evict me. I'm your husband. I'm not evicting my husband, David. I'm evicting a tenant who owes $11,200 in back rent and has been violating the terms of his lease agreement. This is insane. You can't treat me like some stranger who defaulted on rent. I looked at him calmly. David, you signed a lease agreement with Patterson Holdings. You've been in violation of that agreement for 4 months. The fact that you're married to the owner of the company doesn't exempt you from the legal requirements of your rental contract. But where am I supposed to go? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to address direct. David couldn't come back to our house and pretend everything was normal because I now knew about Vanessa. But he couldn't stay at the apartment because I was evicting him from my own property. That's not my problem to solve, I said. You created this situation by lying to both your wife and your girlfriend while stealing money to pay for an apartment you couldn't afford. Now you get to figure out how to deal with the consequences. Catherine, please. I know I made mistakes, but this is vindictive. You're using your business to punish me for personal reasons. I'm using my business to collect rent from a delinquent tenant. If that feels like punishment, maybe you should have considered the financial implications before you started conducting an affair on property I own. David's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with the expression of someone expecting bad news. His face confirmed that his expectations were accurate. Vanessa wants to meet with both of us. Both of us? She says she has a proposal. An hour later, I was sitting in the same coffee shop where I'd first met Vanessa, but this time the dynamic was completely different. She arrived with a leather portfolio and the crisp confidence of someone who'd spent 3 days thinking strategically about an untenable situation. David arrived separately, looking like a man walking to his own execution. "Thank you both for coming," Vanessa said, settling into her chair with the authority of someone running a business meeting. "I've been thinking about our conversation, Catherine, and I have some thoughts about how to resolve this situation in a way that works for everyone." David shifted uncomfortably. "Vanessa, I don't think we need to involve Catherine in decisions about our relationship." Vanessa's voice was arctic. "David, after talking with your wife, I'm not sure we have a relationship. We have a series of lies you've been telling both of us for 8 months." I watched David realize that the dynamic had shifted in ways he didn't understand and couldn't control. The two women he'd been manipulating were now talking to each other, and he was no longer managing the flow of information between us. "Vanessa, I can explain everything. You already explained everything. That's the problem." She opened her portfolio and removed several documents. "These are copies of all the texts you sent me over the past 8 months about Catherine, about how she was pathetic and vindictive, and making your divorce difficult." She placed them on the table where David could see his own words reflected back at him. "This is what you texted me on March 20th. Catherine is making everything complicated because she's too weak to accept that our marriage is over. She keeps clinging to the idea that we can work things out." David's face went red. "I was trying to protect your feelings by lying about the feelings I was supposed to be protected from." Vanessa pulled out another document. "This is what you texted on April 3rd. I hate seeing you upset about the delays, but Catherine is being vindictive about the asset division. She wants to keep me trapped in a marriage that's been over for years." She looked at David with contempt. "Were you protecting my feelings when you told me your wife was pathetic? Or were you just making it easier for yourself to justify what you were doing?" "Vanessa, I'm not finished." She pulled out a third set of documents. "These are the bank statements Catherine showed me for Patterson Holdings. Do you want to explain to me why you've been telling me money was tight while having access to $50,000 per month in rental income?" David looked at me desperately, as if I might intervene on his behalf. "Catherine, you don't understand what it's been like trying to manage this situation." "Manage this situation?" I kept my voice level. "David, you weren't managing a situation. You were conducting two relationships based on lies you were telling both of us about the other." Vanessa leaned forward. "Here's my proposal. David, you've been lying to both of us for 8 months. You've stolen money from Catherine to fund a relationship with me that was based on completely false pretenses. You convinced me I was helping you leave an unhappy marriage when you were actually just cheating on a wife who thought everything was fine. It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple." Vanessa's voice cut through his protests like ice. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to choose, right now, to either you leave Catherine immediately, file for divorce, and figure out how to build a real relationship with me based on honesty instead of lies, or you go home to your wife and end whatever this has been between us." David looked back and forth between us, panic visible in his eyes. "I need time to think about this," Vanessa said firmly. "You've had 8 months to think about this. You've had 8 months to make a choice, and instead you chose to lie to both of us so you wouldn't have to choose at all." She pulled out her phone and placed it on the table. "I'm giving you exactly 60 seconds to decide. Either you call Catherine pathetic one more time and walk out of here with me, accepting that your marriage is over and you'll deal with whatever financial and legal consequences come with that choice, or you admit that what we had was based on lies, apologize to both of us, and go home to try to rebuild the relationship you've been destroying." David stared at the phone like it was a bomb. "This is crazy. You can't give me an ultimatum like this." "I'm not giving you an ultimatum, Dave. I'm giving you a choice. The same choice you should have made 8 months ago instead of deciding to have both of us." The silence at our table stretched uncomfortably while other customers chatted and laughed around us, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. David's breathing was becoming labored, and I could see sweat forming on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the coffee shop. 30 seconds, Vanessa announced. "This isn't fair," David said desperately. "You're both ganging up on me." "We're not ganging up on you," I said quietly. "We're refusing to continue being lied to." 15 seconds. David looked at me with something that might have been genuine regret. "Catherine, I do love you. I never stopped loving you, but I love Vanessa too." Vanessa's laugh was bitter. "You don't love me, David. You love the idea of me. You love the fantasy you created where you could have an exciting affair without giving up the security of your marriage." "That's not true." "Time's up," Vanessa stood and gathered her paper. Since you can't choose, I'll choose for you. I'm done with the lies, with the drama, with pretending that what we had was real when it was just you trying to have everything without paying the price for anything. She looked at me across the table. Catherine, your husband is a coward. He's not going to leave you because leaving would require him to face consequences for his choices. He's not going to commit to building something real with me because that would require him to give up the comfort of his marriage. David reached for her arm as she prepared to leave. Vanessa, please, don't do this. She shrugged him off. I already did it. The moment I realized you'd been lying to me about everything. This was over. What about the apartment? What about our plans? What plans, Dave? The plans you made while lying to me about being separated from your wife? The plans you funded by stealing from the woman you're married to? Vanessa shook her head. Those weren't plans. Those were delusions. After she left, David and I sat in the sudden quiet of the coffee shop. Two people who'd been married for 23 years and had nothing left to say to each other. Are you satisfied? David asked finally. Satisfied with what? With destroying my relationship with Vanessa, with humiliating me, with using your business to force me out of the apartment. I looked at my husband, this man I'd trusted completely until a week ago, and realized that even now, even after everything that had been revealed, he still thought he was the victim in this situation. David, I didn't destroy your relationship with Vanessa. Your relationship with Vanessa was built on lies from the very beginning. It was never real. It felt real. I'm sure it did. Just like our marriage felt real to me while you were stealing from me to pay for dates with another woman. David put his head in his hands. What happens now? Now you figure out what kind of man you want to be. You can go home and try to rebuild the marriage you've been destroying for 8 months. Or you can file for divorce and face the financial consequences of splitting assets with someone who owns $7 million in real estate. Those are my only choices. Those were always your choices. The only difference is that now you have to make them honestly instead of trying to have both by lying to everyone involved. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded on the table between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I don't know how to fix this. You start by being honest, with yourself and with me. What if I can't? What if I've destroyed everything beyond repair? I considered his question seriously. A week ago I would have done anything to save our marriage. Would have forgiven almost any betrayal if it meant keeping our life together intact. But sitting across from this man who'd systematically lied to me while stealing my money to fund an affair, I realized that the marriage I'd been trying to save probably hadn't existed for a long time. Then you deal with the consequences of your choices, I said. That evening David came home and sat in his office, making phone calls in voices too quiet for me to overhear. I assumed he was trying to reach Vanessa, trying to convince her that their confrontation at the coffee shop had been some kind of misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right explanation. But when I walked past his door around 9 p.m., I heard him talking to someone about apartment listings and security deposits. He was looking for a new place to live, somewhere that wasn't owned by his wife or connected to the woman who'd just walked out of his life. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in our living room, looking around at the house we'd bought together 12 years ago. The furniture we'd chosen, the artwork we'd collected, the photographs documenting 23 years of shared experiences that now felt like evidence of a life I'd been living alone without realizing it. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Catherine, this is Vanessa. I wanted to thank you for helping me understand what was really happening. I'm sorry for the things I said about you before I knew the truth. I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. You don't need to apologize. We were both being lied to. Her response came immediately. Can I ask you something? Are you going to try to save your marriage? The question I'd been avoiding since David had walked out of that coffee shop looking like a broken man. I don't know. Are you going to try to get him back? No. I realized today that I was never in love with David. I was in love with the story he told me about himself. The successful man who was trapped in an unhappy marriage, but was brave enough to leave for love. That man doesn't exist. I thought about the David I'd married. The one who'd seemed ambitious and honest and capable of building something meaningful with another person. When had that man been replaced by someone who thought love meant never having to face the consequences of your choice? What are you going to do now? I typed. Focus on my career. Maybe move to a different city for a fresh start. What about you? I looked around our living room again, trying to imagine what it would feel like to live here alone, or to start over somewhere else, or to somehow rebuild a relationship with someone who'd spent 8 months lying to me about the most fundamental aspects of our shared life. I'm going to figure out who I am when I'm not being lied to. David appeared in the doorway of the living room, holding his phone and looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. I found an apartment, he said, month-to-month lease. I can move in this weekend. Are you leaving? The question seemed to surprise him. I thought that's what you wanted. I never said that. But after today, after everything that's happened, how could we possibly go back to normal? He was right, of course. There was no going back to normal, because normal had been built on lies I hadn't known he was telling. But there might be a way forward, if we were both willing to start from a place of complete honesty about who we actually were, and what we actually wanted. We can't go back, David, but we might be able to go forward. What does that mean? I set down my tea and looked at my husband directly. It means you move into that month-to-month apartment, while we both figure out whether there's anything left of our marriage worth saving. You want me to leave? I want you to face the consequences of your choices. You chose to conduct an affair using money you stole from me. You chose to lie to both your wife and your mistress for 8 months. You chose to build a secret life that required betraying everyone who trusted you. David sat down heavily in the chair across from me. And now you figure out how to live with those choices. And I figure out how to live with the knowledge of who you really are when you think no one is watching. We sat in silence for several minutes. Two people who'd shared a bed for 23 years trying to understand how they'd become strangers to each other. Catherine? David said finally. Do you think there's any chance we could work through this? I think there's a chance we could build something new. But it would have to be based on who we actually are, not who we pretended to be. What if who I actually am isn't someone you can love? It was the most honest question he'd asked me in months. Then we'll both have to learn to live with that truth. Over the next 2 weeks, David moved his belongings into a furnished studio apartment across town while I stayed in our house and tried to figure out what my life looked like without the constant undercurrent of deception I hadn't realized I'd been living with. The first thing I did was call Helen Mitchell and schedule a comprehensive review of all Patterson Holdings properties and investments. Catherine? I'm thrilled that you're taking such an active interest in the business, Helen said as we spread financial documents across my kitchen table. Your father would be so proud to see you engaging with his legacy. As we reviewed property values, rental income and expansion opportunities, I realized that I'd inherited not just money but real power. The kind of power that could change lives, support communities and create opportunities for people who needed them. Helen, what would it take to convert some of our residential properties into transitional housing for women leaving difficult situations? Transitional housing, safe, affordable apartments for women who need time and space to rebuild their lives, women escaping domestic violence, or financial abuse, or situations where they've been made to feel powerless. Helen's eyes lit up with interest. It would require some renovations and partnerships with social service organizations, but it's absolutely doable. How many units were you thinking? Let's start with the Meridian building. Convert the residential floors into transitional housing and use the ground floor commercial space for support services, counseling, legal aid, job training, financial literacy. We spent the next 3 hours planning what would become the Catherine Patterson Women's Resource Center, funded by the rental income from properties I'd barely thought about for 5 years. This is ambitious, Catherine, and expensive. Are you sure you want to commit this level of resource? I thought about Vanessa, beautiful and successful, but completely deceived by a man who'd convinced her that stealing from his wife was romantic. I thought about myself, financially comfortable but so disconnected from my own assets, that I'd had no idea my husband was using them to betray me. I'm sure, that evening, I called Vanessa. Catherine, is everything okay? Everything's fine. I wanted to ask you something. You mentioned that you might move to a different city for a fresh start. I've been thinking about too many memories here, and honestly, I'm embarrassed that I fell for David's lies so completely. What if instead of moving away, you stayed and helped me with something? I told her about the resource center, about my plans to create a place where women could rebuild their lives after being betrayed, or deceived, or made to feel powerless. You want me to work for you. I want you to work with me. You understand what it feels like to be lied to by someone you trusted. You know what it's like to discover that the life you thought you were building was based on deception. Vanessa was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. What would I do? Whatever you're good at.
What do you do for work now? Marketing and communications for a consulting firm.
I help businesses tell their stories in ways that connect with their audiences. Perfect. Help me tell the story of what this resource center could be. Help me reach women who need to know that being deceived doesn't make them stupid, and being betrayed doesn't make them worthless. Catherine, can I ask you something personal? Are you and David getting divorced? I looked around the house we'd shared for 12 years, trying to imagine what it would feel like to live here alone permanently, or to start over somewhere new. I don't know yet. We're both trying to figure out who we are when we're not lying to each other, or being lied to. Do you think you could forgive him? I think I could forgive him for having an affair, but I'm not sure I can forgive him for making me complicit in my own betrayal by using my money to pay for it. What do you mean? Every month that David spent Patterson Holdings' income on dates with you, I was unknowingly funding my husband's infidelity. He made me pay for my own humiliation. Vanessa's sharp intake of breath told me she understood the additional layer of violation I was dealing with. God, Catherine, I never thought about it that way. Neither did I until I realized that the restaurant where he took you for your first date pays rent to my company. I've been subsidizing my own betrayal for 8 months. I'm so sorry, you didn't know, but David, he knew exactly what he was doing when he used income from my properties to build a relationship with another woman. We talked for another hour about the resource center, about the services we could provide and the women we could help. By the time we hung up, I had a marketing director, and Vanessa had a purpose that didn't involve trying to fix her relationship with a man who'd never been honest with her. The next morning, David called. Catherine, I've been thinking about what you said about building something new based on who we actually are. And? I want to try. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I want to try to be the man you thought you married. I was quiet for a moment, considering what it would mean to rebuild a marriage with someone who'd proven capable of such systematic deception. David, if we're going to try to work through this, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was 2 weeks ago. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not the wife who trusted you completely while you stole from me. I'm not the woman who let you manage all our finances while I focused on keeping house and staying out of your business affairs. I never wanted you to stay out of our business affair. You never encouraged me to get involved either. For 5 years I let Helen manage a multi-million-dollar company while I played the supportive wife who didn't worry about money because her husband took care of everything. There's nothing wrong with that. There is when the husband is using that trust to steal from the wife. David was quiet for several minutes. When he spoke again, his voice was different. What do you need from me? I need you to understand that if we rebuild this marriage, you'll be married to someone who owns property worth almost $9 million and generates $50,000 per month in income. Someone who's starting a non-profit organization to help women who've been financially abused. Someone who's not going to trust you with money or decision-making or anything else until you prove you're trustworthy. That sounds like you don't want to be married to me at all. I don't want to be married to the man who stole from me to pay for an affair, but I might want to be married to the man who could learn from that choice and become someone worthy of trust again. How do I prove that I'm trustworthy? It was the right question, finally. You start by making full financial restitution for everything you stole from Patterson Holdings. You get a separate apartment and pay your own rent without using any of my money. You go to counseling to understand why you thought lying to 2 women for 8 months was acceptable behavior. What else? You support the Resource Center project even though it means your wife is going to be working closely with your former mistress to help women who've been in situations similar to ours. David's silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. You want me to support you working with Vanessa? I want you to support me doing work that matters to me. The fact that Vanessa is involved is irrelevant, unless you make it relevant. Catherine, that's asking a lot. David, you stole nearly $500,000 from me to conduct an affair in an apartment I own. I'm asking you to pay me back and support my decision to use that money to help other women. If that feels like asking too much, then you're not ready to rebuild this marriage. Another long pause. What if I can't afford to pay you back immediately? Then you set up a payment plan and stick to it. What if you can't handle me working with Vanessa? Then you figure out why that bothers you and deal with those feelings in counseling instead of expecting me to make my professional decisions based on your comfort level. This doesn't feel like rebuilding a marriage, it feels like punishment. I thought about that for a moment, trying to understand why accountability felt like punishment to him. David, for 8 months you made unilateral decisions about our money, our relationship and our future without consulting me or being honest with me. You used my assets to betray me, and you convinced another woman that I was the obstacle to your happiness. I know that. If accountability feels like punishment to you, then you're not ready to be in an equal partnership with someone who has their own money, their own business, and their own opinions about how our life together should work. So what are you saying? I'm saying that if you want to save this marriage, you need to fall in love with the woman I actually am, not the woman I was when I didn't know you were stealing from me. David was quiet for so long I started to think the call had dropped. Catherine, I'm here. I think I need more time to figure out if I can be the man you need me to be. It wasn't the answer I'd been hoping for, but it was honest. Take all the time you need, David. I'll be here, building something that matters to me with or without you. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the architectural plans Helen and I had drawn up for the resource center renovation. It would take 6 months to complete the construction, another month to staff the facility and establish partnerships with legal aid organizations and counseling services. By this time next year, the building where David had conducted his affair would be a place where women could rebuild their lives after being betrayed, deceived, or made to feel powerless. I thought about calling Vanessa to update her on my conversation with David, but decided against. This was about more than my marriage now. This was about creating something that would outlast whatever decision David and I ultimately made about our future together. 3 months later, I was standing in the lobby of what would soon be the Catherine Patterson Women's Resource Center, watching contractors install floor-to-ceiling windows that would let natural light flood the space where women would come to get legal advice, financial counseling, and therapeutic support. It's going to be beautiful, Vanessa said, joining me with coffee and architectural drawing. The counseling suites are almost finished, and the legal aid office should be ready by next week. In the months since our coffee shop confrontation, Vanessa had thrown herself into the Resource Center project with the passion of someone who'd found work that felt personally meaningful. She'd created a website, established partnerships with domestic violence organizations, and developed marketing materials that spoke to women who'd been made to feel ashamed of being deceived. Any word from David? She asked carefully. Vanessa and I had developed a professional friendship based on shared purpose, but we both understood that David remained a complicated subject between us. He's been making his restitution payments on schedule, and he's been in counseling for 2 months. His therapist thinks he's making progress. Do you think he's making progress? I watched the contractors work, transforming the space where David had once conducted his secret relationship into something that would help other women avoid or recover from similar betrayal. I think he's learning to understand the difference between feeling sorry for himself and actually taking responsibility for his choices. That's something, I guess. It's a start. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Can I take you to dinner tonight? Somewhere that doesn't have complicated history for either of us. I showed the message to Vanessa, curious about her reaction. Are you going to go? I think so. We've been doing this careful dance around each other for 3 months. Maybe it's time to have a real conversation about whether there's anything left to rebuild. Do you want there to be? It was the question I'd been asking myself since David moved out of our house and started the slow work of trying to prove he was capable of change. I want there to be a version of David that I could respect enough to love again. But I don't know if that version exists, or if I'm just hoping it does because ending a 23-year marriage feels like admitting failure. Vanessa was quiet for a moment, looking around the space that would soon welcome women who were asking themselves similar questions about relationships they'd invested years in building. Catherine, can I tell you something? Of course. The work we've been doing here, building this place, creating something that will help other women, it's been the most meaningful thing I've done in years, and I realized that I never would have found this sense of purpose if David hadn't lied to both of us. I turned to look at her, surprised by the direction of her thoughts. What do you mean? I mean that his betrayal forced both of us to discover who we were when we weren't being defined by our relationship to him. You found out that you're not just a supportive wife, you're a businesswoman with the power to change lives. I found out that I'm not just someone looking for a man to complete my life, I'm someone who can build something meaningful on my own. She gestured around the construction zone that would soon be a resource center. David thought he could manipulate both of us because he thought we were weaker than we actually are. He was wrong. That evening, David and I sat across from each other at a restaurant neither of us had ever been to before, trying to have the kind of honest conversation we probably should have been having for years. You look different, he said as we waited for our food to arrive. More confident, maybe, like you know something you didn't know before. I thought about the past 3 months, about learning to manage a business that generated more income than David's salary, about creating something that would help women rebuild their lives after betrayal. I do know something I didn't know before. What's that? I know who I am when I'm not being lied to. David winced slightly. Catherine, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did to you. I don't want you to spend the rest of your life making up for anything. I want you to spend it being someone worth trusting. What's the difference? Making up for the past is about guilt and regret. Being trustworthy is about the choices you make going forward. Our food arrived, and we ate in thoughtful silence for several minutes. Finally, my therapist says I was trying to avoid making hard choices by lying to both of you. She says I was more afraid of disappointing anyone than I was of being dishonest. What do you think? I think she's right. I thought if I could manage both relationships carefully enough, I could eventually figure out how to transition from one to the other without anyone getting hurt. But that's not how relationships work. No, it's not. And now I understand that what I was really afraid of was finding out who I was if I had to choose between the safe, comfortable life I had with you and the exciting romantic life I thought I could have with Vanessa. I set down my fork and looked at him directly. And what did you find out? I found out that I'm a coward who was willing to lie to two people I cared about rather than face the consequences of wanting something I couldn't have without giving up something else. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in months. What else did you find out? That the man who could lie to his wife for 8 months while stealing her money isn't someone I want to be. But is he someone you are? David was quiet for a long time, considering the question that would determine whether we had a future together. I think he's someone I became when I was too afraid to be honest about what I wanted. But I don't think he's someone I have to stay. What would you have to do to not stay that person? I'd have to learn to make hard choices honestly, even when those choices disappoint people I care about. I'd have to learn to value truth more than comfort, and integrity more than keeping everyone happy. And how do you learn to do that? By practicing, starting with being completely honest with you about whether I think we can rebuild something worth having together. I waited. Catherine, I want to try. I want to be married to the woman who owns a real estate empire and runs a nonprofit and refuses to let anyone steal from her ever again. I want to be married to someone who's strong enough to work with my former mistress on something meaningful without feeling threatened or diminished. But I don't know if I can be the man who deserves to be married to that woman. Then figure it out, I said simply. The same way I figured out how to be someone who doesn't get stolen from. You make different choices, every day, until the different choices become who you are. David reached across the table and took my hand. Will you give me the chance to try? I looked at this man I'd been married to for 23 years, who'd nearly destroyed us both by trying to avoid making the hard choices that real love requires. I'll give you the chance. But David, if you lie to me again about anything significant, if you steal from me again, if you betray my trust in any way, I won't give you another chance. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't about me being vindictive or unforgiving. It's about me finally understanding that I deserve to be treated with honesty and respect, and I won't accept less than that from anyone, including my husband. I understand, he said again, and this time I believed. 6 months later, the Catherine Patterson Women's Resource Center opened its doors to the first group of women who needed a place to rebuild their lives after financial abuse, domestic violence, or betrayal by someone they'd trust. David and I were still married, still working on learning how to be honest with each other about things that mattered. He'd moved back into our house, but into the guest bedroom while we figured out how to share physical space with someone you're relearning how to trust. Vanessa had become not just my business partner in running the resource center, but a genuine friend whose understanding of betrayal and recovery made her uniquely qualified to help other women navigate similar experiences. On opening day, I stood in the lobby where David had once met his mistress for romantic encounters, watching women fill out intake forms for legal aid consultations and financial counseling sessions. Any regret? Vanessa asked, joining me with a clipboard full of appointments and a smile that suggested she already knew my answer. About what? About turning your husband's love nest into a place that helps women like us. I thought about the question seriously. Did I regret discovering that David had been lying to me? Did I regret confronting Vanessa and learning the scope of his deception? Did I regret the months of uncertainty and rebuilding that had led to this moment? No regrets, I said, only gratitude, for finding out who I really am when someone stops lying to me. That evening, David and I had dinner at home together, something we'd been doing several nights a week as we slowly learned how to be married to the people we'd become after the crisis that had nearly ended. How was the opening day? He asked. Busy. We had 12 women sign up for services, and 3 more scheduled for next week. Are you happy with how it's going? I thought about the women I'd met that day. Women who'd discovered that their husbands had been stealing from them, or lying about money, or using financial control to maintain power in relationships that had become prisons. I'm happy that we can help them, and I'm happy that something good came out of something that could have destroyed me. David was quiet for several minutes, and I could see him working up the courage to say something that might be difficult. Catherine, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Okay. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me completely? Not just say that you forgive me, but actually feel it. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself as we worked through the slow process of rebuilding trust. I think forgiveness isn't something that happens once, Dave. I think it's something you choose to do over and over again, every time you decide to stay married to someone who hurt you badly. What does that mean for us? It means that every day I choose to work on this marriage instead of ending it. I'm choosing forgiveness. But that choice is based on who you are today, not on forgetting who you were when you were lying to me. Will you ever trust me completely again? I'll trust you as much as your behavior earns. If you're honest with me consistently, I'll trust you with bigger things. If you prove you can handle having access to my money without stealing it, I'll trust you with financial decisions again. But it will never be the same as it was before. No, it won't. Because before, my trust was based on ignorance. I trusted you because I didn't know you were lying, not because you'd proven you were trustworthy. David absorbed this, and I could see him processing what it meant to be married to someone who would never again trust blindly. Is that enough for you? I asked. A marriage where trust has to be earned instead of assumed? It's more than I deserve, he said, and it's exactly what I need to become the man I should have been all along. 1 year later, I was standing in the same coffee shop where Vanessa and I had first confronted David together, waiting for a meeting with a reporter who wanted to write about the Resource Center's success in helping women recover from financial abuse. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Board meeting went well. The Henderson project is approved, and the financing came through ahead of schedule. Home by 6 for dinner. I smiled as I typed back. See you then, love you. It had taken us almost 2 years to get to a place where I could text those words and mean them completely, where David could share good news about his work without me wondering if he was lying about where he'd been or what he'd been doing. The Resource Center had helped over 200 women in its first year of operation, and Vanessa and I were planning to expand to include job training programs and transitional housing in addition to the counseling and legal services we already provided. David and I were still married, still learning how to love each other honestly, still working every day to build something stronger than what we'd lost when his lies finally caught up with him. Mrs. Patterson, a young woman approached my table with a notebook and recorded. I'm Sarah Chen from the Tribune. Thank you for agreeing to this interview. As we talked about the Resource Center, about the women we'd helped and the programs we'd developed, Sarah asked the question I'd been expecting. What would you say to women who are in similar situations to the one you faced? Women who suspect their partners might be stealing from them or lying about money. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, trusting and comfortable and completely unaware that my husband was using my own money to betray me. I tell them to trust their instincts. If something feels wrong, investigate. Don't let anyone convince you that wanting to understand your own financial situation is being paranoid or controlling. What else? I tell them that being deceived doesn't make them stupid, and being betrayed doesn't make them worthless. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who are best positioned to hurt us, but that's not our fault. And if they discover that their worst suspicions are true. I thought about the moment I'd realized that David was conducting his affair in a building I owned, using money that ultimately belonged to me. I tell them that discovering the truth, even when it's devastating, is always better than living a lie. And I'd tell them that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the thing that teaches you who you really are when no one is lying to you anymore. After the interview, I drove home to the house David and I shared, where he was making dinner and probably practicing what he'd tell me about his day. Not because he had anything to hide, but because he'd learned that rebuilding trust meant being intentional about honesty, even about small things. How did the interview go? He asked as I walked into our kitchen. Good. She asked thoughtful questions about the work we're doing. Did she ask about us? A little. I told her that sometimes the worst betrayals can lead to the most important discoveries about who you really are. David paused in his dinner preparations and looked at me directly. Do you ever wish none of it had happened? That I'd never had the affair, never lied to you, never forced you to discover that you were stronger than you knew? It was a question he'd asked in various forms over the past year, usually when he was feeling guilty about the pain his choices had caused both of us. I wish you'd been honest with me from the beginning about whatever you were feeling that made you think lying was a better option than talking to me. But I'm grateful to know who I am when I'm not being lied to. I'm grateful to be doing work that matters to me. I'm grateful that I discovered I could rebuild my life around my own values instead of just supporting someone else's dreams. David nodded, continuing to prepare our meal with the careful attention he'd developed for all aspects of our shared life. Sometimes I wonder if the man who could lie to you for 8 months was always part of me, or if he was someone I became when I got scared of making hard decisions. What do you think? I think he was always there, but I'd never been in a situation that required that level of deception before. When I started having feelings for Vanessa, I could have been honest with you about our marriage needing work. When those feelings developed into something more serious, I could have asked for a separation while we figured things out. But Instead, I convinced myself that lying was kinder than honesty, that managing both relationships carefully was better than forcing anyone to deal with painful truths. I watched him measure spices with the same precision he now brought to every aspect of our rebuilt relationship. And now I understand that lying to protect people from difficult emotions is really lying to protect myself from having to deal with their reaction. It had taken David 18 months of individual therapy and 6 months of couples counseling for him to articulate that insight, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he approached conflict and difficult conversation. The reporter asked me something interesting today, I said, setting the table for dinner. She wanted to know what advice I'd give to women who discover their partners have been lying to them about money. What did you tell her? That the lying is usually worse than whatever they're lying about. That someone who can systematically deceive you about finances can systematically deceive you about anything. David paused in his cooking. Do you still think about what else I might have lied about? It was a fair question. When someone violates your trust as completely as David had violated mine, it's natural to wonder what other deceptions might still be hidden. Sometimes, but then I remember that the man who lied to me before doesn't exist anymore, because I would never again be in a relationship with someone who had access to my money without complete transparency.
What do you mean?
I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app that now gave me real-time access to all our accounts, including detailed spending reports and automatic alerts for any transaction over $50. I mean that the woman who trusted blindly because she didn't want to seem controlling doesn't exist anymore either. You can't lie to me about money now because I monitor everything in real time. Does that feel restrictive to you? I considered the question while we sat down to eat together, something we'd been doing consistently as part of rebuilding the intimacy and routine of marriage. It feels safe, not restrictive but protective, like wearing a seatbelt or having smoke detectors in the house. What about for me? Does it feel like you don't trust me? David, you stole nearly $500,000 from me over 8 months. Trust isn't something you get back by asking for it. It's something you earn back by demonstrating that you can handle responsibility without abusing it. And how am I doing with that? I thought about the past year, about David's consistent payments toward his restitution debt, his transparent handling of his own finances, his effort for my work at the resource center even when it meant watching me collaborate with his former mistress on something he wasn't part of. You're doing well, but the fact that you're asking me to evaluate your progress instead of just assuming you've done enough shows me that you understand how trust actually works now. After dinner, we sat in our living room reading separate books, something that had become our preferred way to spend quiet evenings together. The comfortable silence of two people who no longer had to wonder what the other was thinking because they'd learned to ask directly. My phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. Catherine, can you look at the budget projections for the job training program? I think we can expand faster than we originally planned. I opened the attached spreadsheet, reviewing Vanessa's analysis of our funding capacity and projected demand for services. Work? David asked, noticing my attention shift to my phone. Vanessa's numbers on the job training expansion. She thinks we can serve twice as many women as we budgeted for. That's great news. David's response was genuinely enthusiastic, without the undercurrent of discomfort that had colored his reactions to my collaboration with Vanessa during the early months of our reconciliation. You're really okay with how much time I spend working with her? Catherine, 2 years ago I would have been jealous and insecure about you working closely with any woman I'd had a relationship with. But watching you both turn something destructive into something that helps people has been one of the most impressive things I've ever witnessed. What changed for you? I realized that being uncomfortable with you working with Vanessa was really being uncomfortable with facing the consequences of my own choices. She's not the problem in our marriage. My lying was the problem. Her being part of the solution doesn't threaten me unless I make it about me. I looked at my husband, this man who'd nearly destroyed us both with his deception and who'd spent 2 years learning to think differently about honesty, responsibility, and what it meant to be married to someone with their own power and purpose. I'm proud of you, I said, for becoming someone who can say that and mean it. The next morning, I arrived at the resource center to find Vanessa already at work in our shared office, surrounded by case files and funding applications. Morning, she said without looking up from her computer. The Henderson Foundation approved our grant request, full funding for the job training program, plus enough extra to hire 2 more counselors. How much? $450,000 over 3 years. I sat down at my desk, processing the magnitude of what Vanessa had accomplished. When we'd started the Resource Center 18 months ago, I'd funded it entirely from Patterson Holdings' income. Now we were attracting major foundation support for programs that were making a measurable difference in women's lives. Vanessa, This is incredible. It's what happens when you can show real results. The data from our first year is compelling, and our outcomes tracking demonstrates that women who complete our programs have a 93% success rate in achieving financial independence. I looked around our office thinking about how different both our lives had become since the day we'd confronted David together in that coffee shop. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't called you that day? If we'd never compared notes about what David was telling both of us? Vanessa finally looked up from her computer, considering the question. I think we both would have figured out eventually that he was lying, but we might have figured it out separately, and we might have spent months or years blaming each other instead of recognizing that we were both being deceived. And then I probably would have moved to a different city to start over, and you probably would have stayed married to someone who was still lying to you about fundamental things, and neither of us would have discovered what we were capable of building together. She gestured around our office where the walls were covered with thank you letters from women who'd rebuilt their lives with help from our programs. I would never have known that I was good at this kind of work. You would never have known that you had the power to create something this meaningful. Do you think we would have been happy? I think we would have been safe, but safe isn't the same as happy, and it's definitely not the same as fulfilled. That afternoon, I was reviewing financial reports when my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. Mrs. Patterson, this is Detective Maria Santos with the Financial Crimes Unit. I'm calling about a case that involves you as a potential victim of financial fraud. My stomach dropped. What kind of case? We've arrested a man named Marcus Webb for running an investment scam targeting married women. His pattern was to pose as a successful businessman, having marital problems, then convince women to invest in fake real estate deals using money they had access to through their marriages. I don't understand how this involves me. Ms. Webb had extensive files on you, including detailed information about Patterson Holdings and your personal financial situation. He also had documentation of your husband's affair and information about your divorce proceedings. I felt cold suddenly. What kind of documentation? Photos of your husband with another woman, copies of financial records, even floor plans of properties you own. It appears he was planning to target you as his next victim. How did he get this information? We're still investigating, but it looks like he hired a private investigator to gather intelligence on potential targets. You fit his profile perfectly. Wealthy woman going through a divorce, emotionally vulnerable, with access to significant liquid assets. After Detective Santos hung up, I sat in my office trying to process what I'd learned. While David and I had been working to rebuild our marriage, a stranger had been researching my financial vulnerability and planning to exploit my emotional state for his own gain. I called David immediately. Catherine, you sound upset. I just got a call from the police. Apparently, while we've been dealing with the aftermath of your affair, someone has been investigating me as a potential fraud victim. I explained Detective Santos's call, watching David's face change as he understood the implications. Someone was planning to target you because they thought you were getting divorced. Someone was planning to target me because they had detailed information about our marriage problems, my financial situation, and what they assumed would be my emotional vulnerability. David was quiet for several minutes, processing what this meant. Catherine, if I hadn't had the affair, if our marriage hadn't been in crisis, you wouldn't have been on this person's radar. Probably not. So my lying to you didn't just betray you directly, it also made you vulnerable to being victimized by someone else. The weight of this additional consequence seemed to hit David harder than anything else we'd discussed about the impact of his deception. David, you couldn't have known that your affair would make me a target for financial predators. But the same way you owning the building where I conducted the affair was a consequence neither of us anticipated. Actions have ripple effects we can't predict or control. That evening, Detective Santos called back with an update. Miss Patterson, we've learned more about how Marcus Webb was planning to approach you. He was going to pose as someone going through a similar divorce situation, probably at a support group or social event for separated spouses. What would his approach have been? He would have presented himself as someone who understood what you were going through, then gradually introduced investment opportunities that seemed legitimate but were designed to steal your money. How much money are we talking about? Based on his previous victims, anywhere from $50,000 to several $1,000,000, depending on how much access he could gain to your accounts. After hanging up, I thought about the strange parallel between Marcus Webb and Dave. Both men had identified me as someone who could be deceived because I trusted people who presented themselves as caring about my well-being. Both had planned to use my own resources against me while convincing me they were protecting or helping me. The difference was that David's deception had been personal and emotional, while Marcus Webb's would have been purely predatory. But the underlying assumption was the same. Catherine Patterson was someone who could be manipulated because she trusted too easily and didn't pay enough attention to her own financial interests. 2 years ago, they both would have been right. Now, Marcus Webb would have found himself trying to scam someone who monitored every financial transaction in real time, who had learned to investigate anyone who seemed too interested in her personal business, who had built a support network of people committed to helping women avoid exactly the kind of exploitation he specialized in. When I shared this realization with David that evening, he was quiet for a long time. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I'm thinking that the worst thing I ever did to you might have accidentally saved you from something even worse." "How do you figure that?" "If I hadn't betrayed you, you never would have learned to protect yourself from people who want to take advantage of you. You never would have become suspicious of men who seem too interested in your financial situation." I thought about the woman I'd been before finding that receipt in David's pocket. Trusting, comfortable, financially naive despite owning millions of dollars in assets. You might be, but that doesn't make what I did okay. No, it doesn't. But it might mean that something good came out of something terrible, which is more than we could have hoped for 2 years ago. 3 months later, I was testifying in Marcus Webb's trial as a potential victim who'd been targeted but never approached because his scheme had been discovered before he could make contact. "Miss Patterson," the prosecutor asked, "based on your experience recovering from financial deception in your marriage, do you believe you would have been vulnerable to Mr. Webb's approach 2 years ago?" I thought about the question carefully before answering. 2 years ago, I would have been the perfect victim for someone like Mr. Webb. I was financially comfortable but uninvolved in managing my own assets. I trusted people who showed interest in my personal life. I would have been emotionally vulnerable and looking for someone who understood what I was going through. And now I understand that people who seem very interested in my financial situation, or my personal problems, might have motives that aren't in my best interest. I've learned to verify information independently and to be suspicious of anyone who wants to help me make financial decisions without proper credentials and oversight. What advice would you give to other women who might be targeted by similar schemes? Trust your instincts when something feels too good to be true. Don't make major financial decisions when you're emotionally vulnerable. And remember that people who really want to help you won't pressure you to act quickly or secretly. After the trial, Vanessa and I returned to the Resource Center, where we'd been developing a workshop series on financial fraud prevention based partly on my experience with Marcus Webb's targeting. "How do you feel about the testimony?" she asked as we reviewed the materials for our next workshop. "Proud, actually. 2 years ago, I would have been ashamed to admit that I could have been easily victimized. Now I understand that acknowledging vulnerability is the first step in building real protection. The women in our programs respond well to hearing that you've been where they are. Because I have been. I've been the woman who trusted someone who was stealing from me. I've been the woman who had access to significant assets, but no real understanding of how to protect. I've been the woman who thought that paying attention to money was somehow beneath me or unromantic." I looked around the Resource Center, where women were meeting with legal advocates, attending financial literacy classes, and learning to rebuild their lives after various forms of betrayal and deception. The difference is that I was fortunate enough to discover the truth about my situation before I lost everything, and I had the resources to rebuild from a position of strength. Not everyone is that fortunate, which is why we're here. That evening, David and I attended our monthly couples counseling session, something we'd committed to continuing even though our marriage had stabilized significantly over the past year. "How are you both feeling about the upcoming anniversary of the disclosure?" Dr. Martinez asked. It had been almost exactly 2 years since I'd found that receipt in David's pocket and started the investigation that had led to discovering his affair, my own financial power, and ultimately, a completely different kind of marriage than the one we'd had before. Reflective. I've been thinking about how much has changed, not just in our relationship, but in who I am as a person. What's changed the most? I used to think that trusting people completely was a virtue. That good wives didn't question their husbands about money or demand transparency about finance. I thought that love meant never having to verify what someone told you. And now I understand that trust without accountability isn't trust, it's naivety. That real love includes expecting honesty and providing it consistently. Dr. Martinez turned to David. "How do you feel about the changes in Catherine?" "Proud of her mostly. Sometimes intimidated by her, but in a good way." "What do you mean by intimidated?" "I mean that the woman I'm married to now wouldn't tolerate the kind of deception I was capable of 2 years ago. She's financially sophisticated, professionally accomplished, and completely unwilling to be lied to about anything important. How does that affect your relationship? It makes me more honest, because I know that lying to her isn't just morally wrong, it's practically impossible. She has systems in place that would detect financial deception immediately, and she has the self-confidence to confront me directly about anything that doesn't make sense. Do you miss the way things were before? David considered this carefully. I miss how easy it was to avoid difficult conversations when Catherine was more focused on keeping everyone happy than on making sure she was being treated fairly. But I don't miss being the kind of person who would take advantage of that. What about you, Catherine? Do you miss anything about who you were before? I miss feeling like I could trust people completely without having to think about their motives. But I don't miss being vulnerable to the kind of exploitation that trust made possible. On the drive home from counseling, David asked me a question he'd never asked before. Catherine, do you think we're happier now than we were before everything fell apart? I thought about our life 2 years ago, when I'd been completely unaware that David was lying to me, when I'd trusted him to handle our finances while I focused on maintaining our home and social life. I think I'm more myself now than I was then. What does that mean? I mean that the woman who inherited a multi-million-dollar business and then ignored it while she played supportive housewife wasn't really me. She was who I thought I was supposed to be. And who are you really? Someone who enjoys building things that matter. Someone who's good at managing money and creating opportunities for other people. Someone who doesn't need to be taken care of because she's capable of taking care of herself. Do you think I fell in love with the wrong version of you? I think you fell in love with a version of me that was convenient for you. Someone who didn't ask questions, didn't demand transparency, didn't have her own ambitions that might compete with yours. And now you're married to someone who asks questions, demands transparency, and has ambitions that are just as important to her as yours are to you. David was quiet for several minutes as we drove through our neighborhood, past houses where other couples were probably having their own conversations about trust and honesty and what it meant to really know someone. Catherine, can I tell you something? Always. The man who had an affair with Vanessa while lying to you about it was trying to have everything without paying the price for anything. But the man I am now, married to the woman you are now, has something much more valuable, which is a real partnership with someone who chooses to be with me every day, not because she doesn't know any better, but because she knows exactly who I am and decides I'm worth the risk anyway. 6 months later, I was standing on the stage of the Meridian Building's renovated conference center, addressing an audience of 200 women who'd come to hear about financial protection and recovery from betrayal. 3 years ago, I began, my husband was conducting an affair in this very building, using money he'd stolen from a business I owned but had never bothered to understand. I was the perfect victim, financially comfortable but financially ignorant, trusting but not discerning, focused on everyone's happiness except my own protection. I paused, looking out at faces that reflected my own experience back at me. Women who'd discovered that their partners were lying to them about money, women who'd realized they'd been funding their own betrayal, women who were trying to rebuild their lives after discovering that the people they'd trusted most had been taking advantage of them. Today, this building houses a resource center that has helped over 500 women protect themselves from financial abuse and rebuild their lives after betrayal. The apartment where my husband met his mistress is now a counseling center, where women learn that being deceived doesn't make them stupid, and being betrayed doesn't make them worthless. The applause was warm, encouraging, but I wasn't finished. The most important thing I want to tell you is this. Discovering that someone has been lying to you is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Living with those lies for the rest of your life is the worst thing that can happen to you. I looked out at the audience, many of whom were probably facing the same choice I'd faced 3 years ago when I found that receipt in David's pocket. Truth is difficult. Truth forces you to make decisions you'd rather avoid. Truth requires you to face things about yourself and the people you love that are uncomfortable and sometimes painful. But truth also gives you power. The power to make real choices about your life instead of choices based on false information. The power to protect yourself instead of relying on other people to protect you. The power to build something genuine instead of something based on deception. After the presentation, I was approached by a woman in her 40s who looked familiar, though I couldn't place her immediately. Ms. Patterson, I wanted to thank you for everything you said today. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I was one of Marcus Webb's victims. The recognition hit me immediately. Rebecca had been mentioned during Webb's trial as one of the women he'd defrauded out of her divorce settlement. Rebecca, how are you doing? Much better thanks to programs like yours. After I lost my settlement to Webb's fake investment scheme, I thought I'd never recover financially or emotionally. But working with organizations like your resource center, has taught me that being victimized doesn't have to define the rest of my life. What's next for you? I'm starting my own consulting business, helping other fraud victims navigate the legal system and rebuild their credit. I want to turn my experience into something that helps other people avoid what happened to me. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the conversation with Rebecca, about the women in the audience who were facing their own moments of truth about relationships built on deception, about the strange journey that had led from discovering my husband's affair to standing on a stage helping other women protect themselves from similar betrayal. David was waiting for me in our kitchen, cooking dinner and humming quietly to himself, completely comfortable in the knowledge that I knew where he'd been, what he'd been doing, and exactly how much money he'd spent while doing it. "How was the presentation?" he asked as I walked in. "Good. I met one of Marcus Webb's victims. She's starting her own business helping other fraud victims." "That's great. It sounds like the work you're doing is having a real ripple effect." I thought about ripple effects, about how actions create consequences that spread far beyond what anyone can predict or control. David's affair had nearly destroyed our marriage, but it had also led to my discovering abilities I'd never known I had, creating a resource center that had helped hundreds of women, and developing a partnership with Vanessa that had become one of the most meaningful relationships in my life. Marcus Webb's plan to defraud me had been prevented by the very crisis that had made me a target in the first place, and his arrest had led to helping his actual victims rebuild their lives. "David, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever wonder if everything that happened was somehow supposed to happen? If there was some larger purpose to all the pain and deception and rebuilding?" David considered this while he finished preparing our meal. "I used to think that believing everything happened for a reason was just a way to avoid taking responsibility for the damage I'd caused. But watching what you've built from the wreckage of our marriage, seeing how many women have been helped by programs that exist because of what we went through together, I think maybe some good things can come from terrible choices if people are willing to do the work to create meaning from their pain." "Is that what we did?" "I think that's what you did. I just learned to be honest enough to be worthy of being married to someone who could turn betrayal into purpose." That night, as we got ready for bed together in the house we'd almost lost to lies and deception, I reflected on the woman I'd been 3 years ago, and the woman I'd become through the process of discovering and recovering from betrayal. The woman I'd been would have been destroyed by Marcus Webb's fraud scheme, would have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars to someone who presented himself as understanding and supportive while systematically stealing from her. The woman I'd become would have detected his deception immediately, would have verified his credentials and investigated his investment opportunities before risking a single dollar of her hard-earned money. The difference wasn't just knowledge or experience, though both of those mattered. The difference was understanding my own worth and refusing to accept anything less than complete honesty from anyone who wanted access to my resources, my emotions, or my trust. As I fell asleep next to David, this man who'd learned to earn back the trust he'd betrayed, I thought about the speech I'd given that afternoon, and the women in the audience who were facing their own moments of truth about relationships that might not be what they seem. Tomorrow, some of them would choose to investigate their suspicions. Some would discover that their fears were justified, and their lives would change dramatically as they faced the truth about people they'd trusted completely. Some would decide that the risk of knowing was worse than the comfort of not knowing, and they'd go back to their lives with their questions unanswered. But all of them would carry the knowledge that they had choices, that being deceived didn't make them stupid, and that truth, however difficult, was always preferable to living a lie. And maybe, just maybe, some of them would discover that the worst thing that ever happened to them could become the thing that taught them who they really were when no one was lying to them anymore. The resource center would be there for all of them, in the building where deception had once flourished, now transformed into a place where truth was valued above comfort and strength was built from the ruins of betrayal. Sometimes the pathetic housewife turns out to be the one holding all the power. Sometimes the love nest becomes the foundation for something more important than love. Sometimes the worst betrayal becomes the beginning of the most authentic life you've ever lived. And sometimes the woman who thought she needed protecting turns out to be the one everyone else needs protection from. 5 years had passed since that morning, when I first found David's receipt from Romano's, and I was standing in the conference room of Patterson Holdings' new headquarters, looking out at the city skyline, while reviewing the quarterly reports that showed our empire had grown to 15 properties worth over $12 million. The knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. "Come." Helen Mitchell entered carrying a thick folder and wearing the expression she reserved for delivering particularly significant news. "Catherine, you're going to want to see this." She placed the folder on my desk and opened it to reveal a series of legal documents. "We've been approached by Sterling Development Group, They want to purchase the entire Patterson Holdings portfolio for $18 million cash. I stared at the numbers, trying to process what Helen was telling me. $18 million would set me up for life, would allow me to focus entirely on the resource center, without worrying about property management or rental income, or any of the business responsibilities that had become such a central part of my identity. What's Sterling Development Group? High-end commercial real estate firm. They specialize in converting older buildings into luxury mixed-use developments. Very reputable, excellent references. I flipped through the purchase offer, noting the generous terms and the quick closing timeline they were proposing. Why are they interested in our portfolio specifically? Helen sat down across from my desk. Location, mostly. Our properties are all in areas that are experiencing significant gentrification. Sterling sees them as prime candidates for high-end conversion projects. What would happen to our current tenants? Sterling would honor existing leases until they expire, but they wouldn't be renewing any residential tenants who can't afford the rent increases that come with luxury renovations. I thought about Miss Chen, who'd been renting her small apartment on Maple Street for 6 years while saving money to bring her grandchildren to America. About the Rodriguez family, who'd finally found affordable housing near their children's school after years of moving every time rents went up. So they'd essentially be displacing everyone who isn't wealthy enough to afford luxury housing. That's typically how these conversion projects work, yes. I closed the folder and looked out at the city again, thinking about the choice I was being asked to make. $18 million would solve every financial concern I could possibly have for the rest of my life. But it would also mean abandoning the tenants who depended on Patterson Holdings to provide affordable housing in a market where such options were becoming increasingly scarce. Helen, what do you think I should do? Financially, it's an excellent offer. You'd be set for life and you could focus entirely on the resource center without worrying about property management. But you'd also be contributing to the exact kind of displacement that creates the problems the resource center exists to solve. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the Sterling development offer while David prepared dinner in the kitchen. We'd settled into a comfortable rhythm over the past year, both of us fully committed to the marriage we'd rebuilt from the ruins of his deception. "Everything okay?" David asked as he brought me a cup of tea. "You've been quiet since you got home." I told him about Sterling's offer, watching his face as he processed the magnitude of what was being proposed. $18 million, he repeated. "Catherine, that's generational wealth." "I know. But you're not excited about it." "I'm conflicted about it." David sat down in the chair across from my desk, the same chair where we'd had so many difficult conversations during the worst period of our marriage. "What's the conflict?" "Taking this offer would make me incredibly wealthy, but it would also displace dozens of families who depend on my properties for affordable housing. Could you use the money to create even more affordable housing somewhere else?" "Maybe, but probably not in the same neighborhoods, and definitely not quickly enough to help the people who would be forced out by Sterling's renovations." David was quiet for several minutes, thinking through the implications of what I was describing. "This is about more than money for you, isn't it? Everything I've learned over the past 5 years has been about understanding that real power comes with real responsibility. I can't claim to care about helping women rebuild their lives while simultaneously making decisions that destabilize the lives of families who depend on me." "So you're going to turn down $18 million? "I'm going to find a third option." The next morning, I called an emergency meeting with Vanessa and Helen to discuss alternatives to selling the portfolio to Sterling Development. "What if we formed our own development company?" I proposed. "We could renovate the buildings ourselves, but in ways that maintain affordability for existing tenants while also improving the properties." Vanessa leaned forward with interest. "That would require significant capital investment up front, but it could work long term." "How much capital are we talking about?" Helen pulled out her calculator and started running numbers. "Probably $3 to $4 million over 2 years, depending on the scope of renovation. I could fund that from the Resource Center's reserve accounts and Patterson Holdings' accumulated profits." "But Catherine," Vanessa said carefully, "that would mean risking a significant portion of your wealth on a development project you've never attempted before, as opposed to taking a guaranteed $18 million and letting someone else displace families I've been housing for years." "There's also a fourth option," Helen said quietly. We both looked at her. "You could sell to Sterling but negotiate terms that protect existing tenants, require them to provide relocation assistance, or to reserve a certain percentage of units for affordable housing after renovation." I considered this compromise, trying to weigh the financial security of accepting Sterling's offer against the ethical implications of what would happen to my tenants afterward. Would Sterling agree to those kinds of restrictions? Probably not. They're in the business of maximizing profit from luxury development, not providing affordable housing. Then we're back to choosing between financial gain and social responsibility. Catherine, do you remember what you told me 3 years ago when we first started working together? Remind me, you said that the most important thing you'd learned was that real power comes with real responsibility. That you couldn't claim to care about protecting women while making decisions that put them at risk. She gestured toward the Sterling Development folder. This is the same choice, just at a larger scale. That afternoon, I drove to the Meridian building to walk through the property and think about what I wanted to do. The Resource Center occupied the first 2 floors, bustling with women attending financial literacy classes, meeting with legal advocates, and participating in job training programs. I took the elevator to the residential floors, where I found Mrs. Chen in the hallway checking her mailbox. "Mrs. Patterson," she said with the warm smile she always gave me. "How nice to see you." "Hello, Mrs. Chen. How are your grandchildren?" "Very well, thank you. My grandson just started kindergarten at the school down the street. We are so grateful to live close enough for him to walk." I thought about Sterling Development's plans for the building, about luxury renovations that would price out families like Miss Chen's, about my grandson walking to a school he'd have to leave if they were forced to move to a neighborhood they could afford. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that no matter what changes happen with this building, we'll make sure you and your family have a secure place to live." She looked puzzled. "Are there going to be changes?" "There might be, but I promise you won't have to worry about finding somewhere else to live." After visiting with several other tenants, and seeing how many families had built their lives around the stability of affordable housing in expensive neighborhoods, I knew what I had to do. I called Helen from the building's lobby. "Schedule a meeting with Sterling Development for tomorrow morning. I want to decline their offer in person." The next day, I sat across from 3 executives from Sterling Development in their sleek downtown office, explaining my decision to reject their $18 million offer. "Miss Patterson," said the lead executive, a polished woman in her 50s named Sandra Walsh, "I have to say this is unprecedented. We've never had a property owner turn down an offer of this magnitude. I understand it's unusual. Can we ask what your concerns are? Perhaps there are aspects of the deal we could modify." I looked around their conference room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive artwork, and thought about Miss Chan's grandson walking to kindergarten and the Rodriguez family finally having stable housing near their children's school. "My concern is that your development plans would displace dozens of families who depend on affordable housing in these neighborhoods." Sandra Walsh exchanged glances with her colleagues. "Mrs. Patterson, with respect, urban development always involves some displacement. That's an inevitable part of improving neighborhoods. Improving for whom? For residents who can afford quality housing and premium amenities. What about residents who can't afford quality housing at premium prices but still deserve to live in safe neighborhoods with good schools?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about Sterling Development's priorities. "Miss Patterson," Sandra said finally, "I admire your social consciousness, but $18 million is a life-changing amount of money. Are you certain you want to turn this down for abstract principles? They're not abstract principles when you know the families who would be affected." After declining Sterling's offer, I spent the next 6 months developing Patterson Holdings' own renovation plans for our property. Instead of luxury conversions that would price out existing tenants, we designed improvements that would enhance safety and comfort while maintaining affordability. The projects cost $2 million and reduced our annual profit margins significantly, but they allowed every existing tenant to remain in their homes while living in substantially improved conditions. Vanessa handled the marketing and community outreach for what we called the Partnership Renovation Project, emphasizing our commitment to stable, affordable housing in gentrifying neighborhoods. "We could have been millionaires 18 times over," she said one afternoon as we reviewed progress reports from all 15 properties. "We're already millionaires. The question was whether we wanted to be the kind of millionaires who displace families or the kind who protect them. Do you ever regret the choice?" I thought about Mrs. Chan's grandson, still walking to the same school from the same apartment, just with updated plumbing and new windows. I thought about the dozens of families who hadn't had to uproot their lives because I'd chosen responsibility over maximum profit. Never. 2 years later, I was standing in front of an audience of 500 women at the National Conference on Financial Empowerment, delivering the keynote address about the relationship between wealth and responsibility. 7 years ago, I began, I thought wealth meant having enough money to be comfortable and secure. I thought success meant not having to worry about finances. I paused, looking out at faces that represented women at every stage of financial recovery and empowerment. Today I understand that real wealth isn't about having enough money to be comfortable. It's about having enough power to make choices that reflect your values, even when those choices cost you money. I told them about Sterling Development's offer, about the choice between $18 million and protecting affordable housing for families who depended on it. The most expensive decision I've ever made was turning down that offer. It cost me more money than most people will see in their lifetimes. But it was also the decision that taught me the difference between being rich and being powerful. Rich people have money. Powerful people use money to create the kind of world they want to live in. After my presentation, I was approached by a young woman who looked familiar, though I couldn't immediately place her. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Jennifer Rodriguez. My family rented from you in the Meridian building when I was in high school." The recognition hit me immediately. Jennifer was the daughter of the family I'd thought about when declining Sterling's offer. "Jennifer, how are you? I just graduated from law school, and I wanted to thank you personally. If you had sold our building to developers when I was in high school, we would have had to move to a different school district. I probably wouldn't have had the same educational opportunities." She pulled out a business card with her name and the logo of a legal aid organization. "I'm starting work next month as a housing rights attorney, helping families fight illegal evictions and predatory landlords." "That's wonderful. It's because of people like you that families like mine get the stability we need to build better lives. I wanted you to know that your choices have consequences you might never see, but they matter more than you could possibly know." That evening, I called David from my hotel room to tell him about my conversation with Jennifer Rodriguez. "She's becoming a housing rights attorney because her family had stable housing during her high school years. Because you chose to protect affordable housing instead of maximizing profit. Because we chose to be the kind of people who use power responsibly instead of just accumulating wealth for its own sake. Do you think the woman you were 7 years ago would have made the same choice?" I thought about the woman who'd been so disconnected from her own assets that she'd unknowingly funded her husband's affair, who'd trusted completely without ever verifying, who'd thought that paying attention to money was somehow beneath her. The woman I was 7 years ago never would have been in a position to make that choice. She would have let someone else manage her wealth and make decisions about her properties. And if she had been in that position, she probably would have taken the $18 million and felt guilty about it later, but she wouldn't have understood that she had the power to create alternatives. The next morning, I flew home to find Vanessa waiting in my office with news that would test everything we'd built together. "Catherine, we need to talk about something serious." She sat down across from my desk with an expression I hadn't seen since the early days after David's affair, when we were both still figuring out how to work together despite the complicated history between us. "What's wrong?" "I've been offered a position in San Francisco, director of development for a national organization that's trying to replicate resource center programs in 20 cities across the country." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Vanessa had become not just my business partner but one of my closest friends. The idea of running the resource center without her felt almost impossible. That's an incredible opportunity. It would mean leaving everything we've built here, but it would also mean expanding everything we've built here to help thousands more women across the country. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "I haven't accepted yet. I wanted to talk to you first. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that 7 years ago, I was a woman who thought the most important thing in life was finding the right man to take care of me. Now I'm a woman who's being recruited to lead a national movement to help other women take care of themselves. That's an extraordinary transformation. It happened because I learned what real partnership looked like by working with you. Because I discovered what I was capable of when I stopped trying to be the perfect girlfriend and started trying to be a person who contributed something meaningful to the world." I looked around our office, thinking about all the late nights we'd spent planning programs, all the women we'd helped, all the ways we'd grown individually and together over the past 5 years. "Vanessa, you have to take the job. What about the resource center?" "The resource center will evolve. Maybe I'll hire someone new to work with me here. Maybe I'll start traveling to help establish programs in other cities. Maybe I'll discover that I'm ready for a new challenge too." "You wouldn't be hurt if I left?" I thought about the question seriously. Would I be hurt? Yes. Would I be proud of her for taking an opportunity to expand the impact of work that had started with our shared experience of betrayal? Absolutely. I'd be hurt if you stayed because you were afraid to take a risk that could help thousands of women just to protect my feelings. "Catherine, what if this is a mistake? What if I'm not ready for this level of responsibility? What if you..." What if the woman who could rebuild her life after discovering that her entire relationship was based on lies is exactly the kind of woman who should be leading a national movement to help other women do the same thing? 3 months later, I stood in the airport saying goodbye to Vanessa as she left for San Francisco to begin her new role. "I'm going to miss working with you every day," she said as we hugged goodbye. "I'm going to miss having someone around who understands exactly what it feels like to discover that the person you trusted most was lying to you about everything. But we both know that's not the most important thing about us anymore. That we're both women who turned the worst betrayal of our lives into the foundation for work that matters more than any relationship that was based on deception ever could have." 6 months after Vanessa left for San Francisco, I received a call that would change the direction of my life once again. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Dr. Elizabeth Warren from the Institute for Women's Economic Security. We've been following your work with the Patterson Resource Center, and we'd like to offer you a position as our National Director of Financial Recovery Program." I looked around my office, thinking about the women who came through our doors every day, about the programs we'd developed, about the partnerships we'd built with legal aid organizations and counseling services. "Warren, I'm honored by the offer, but I'm not sure I'm ready to leave the work I'm doing here." "Actually, we're not asking you to leave that work, we want you to expand it. We want to fund resource centers like yours in 50 cities. With you overseeing program development and training." The scope of what she was proposing took my breath away. 50 cities, thousands of women, a national network of programs based on the model Vanessa and I had developed from our shared experience of betrayal and recovery. What would that look like practically? You'd travel extensively, working with local organizations to establish resource centers. You'd develop standardized programs and training materials. You'd become the face of a national movement to help women protect themselves from financial abuse and recover from betrayal. After Warren hung up, I sat in my office looking at the photographs on my wall. Pictures of women who'd graduated from our programs, images from our fundraising events, certificates recognizing the resource center's impact on the community. David found me there an hour later, still staring at the evidence of what we'd built from the ruins of his betrayal. "Everything okay?" I told him about Dr. Warren's offer, about the possibility of taking our local programs national, about becoming the director of a movement that could help thousands of women across the country. "That's incredible, Catherine. Are you going to accept? It would mean traveling constantly, being away from home for weeks at a time, leaving the day-to-day operations of the resource center to someone else. It would also mean exponentially expanding the impact of work that's already changed hundreds of lives." I thought about Jennifer Rodriguez, now working as a housing rights attorney because her family had stable housing during her formative years. I thought about all the women who could be helped by programs that didn't exist yet in cities where resources like ours weren't available. "David, what do you think about being married to someone who travels 3 weeks out of every month?" "I think I'd be proud to be married to someone who's leading a national movement to protect women from the kind of betrayal I put you through, even if it means spending a lot of time alone." "Catherine, 7 years ago I was willing to lie to both my wife and my mistress for months rather than face the consequences of my choices. Now I understand that real love means supporting the person you care about and becoming their highest self, even when that's inconvenient for you. And if I become someone different through this work, someone you didn't marry?" David was quiet for a long time, considering the question that had become central to our rebuilt marriage. "The woman I married 7 years ago never would have been offered a position like this. She never would have built something that mattered enough to be worth expanding nationally." "That's true. So I guess the question isn't whether you'll become someone different. The question is whether you'll become someone I can still be worthy of being married to." 3 months later, I accepted Dr. Warren's offer and became the National Director of Financial Recovery Programs for the Institute for Women's Economic Security. My first assignment was to establish resource centers in 10 pilot cities, training local staff and adapting our programs to serve different regional populations. The work was challenging, exhausting, and deeply fulfilling in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every city brought new stories of women who'd been betrayed by people they'd trusted, who discovered that their financial security was an illusion, who needed help rebuilding their lives from positions of knowledge and strength rather than naivety and vulnerability. In Detroit, I met a woman whose husband had secretly mortgaged their paid-off house to fund a gambling addiction. In Phoenix, I worked with a single mother whose ex-partner had destroyed her credit by opening accounts in her name. In Atlanta, I trained counselors to help women whose families had been stealing from them for years under the guise of managing their finances. Each story was different, but the underlying pattern was always the same. Women who'd trusted people who didn't deserve their trust, who'd been made to feel responsible for betrayals they hadn't caused, who needed to learn that being victimized didn't make them stupid and being betrayed didn't make them worthless. A year into my national role, I was delivering a presentation to potential funders in New York when I was approached by a woman who looked familiar, though I couldn't immediately place her. "Mrs. Patterson, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Sandra Walsh from Sterling Development Group." The recognition was immediate and surprising. Sandra Walsh had been the executive who'd tried to convince me to sell Patterson Holdings to her company for $18 million. "Sandra, of course I remember you. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you. I wanted to tell you something. After our meeting 3 years ago, when you turned down our offer to protect affordable housing, I couldn't stop thinking about what you'd said. About displacement, about the difference between improving neighborhoods for people who can already afford quality housing, and improving them for people who need affordable options." Sandra pulled out a business card with a new company name, Inclusive Development Partner. "I left Sterling last year to start my own firm. We specialize in renovation projects that maintain affordability while improving living conditions. I wanted to thank you for helping me understand that development doesn't have to mean displacement." "That's wonderful, Sandra. We're working on projects in 8 cities now, and we've helped over 200 families stay in their neighborhoods through renovation rather than being forced out by it." As I flew home that evening, I reflected on the conversation with Sandra Walsh and what it represented. 7 years ago, when I'd found that receipt in David's pocket, I'd thought the worst thing that could happen to me was discovering that my husband was having an affair. I'd been wrong. The worst thing would have been continuing to live with his deception, continuing to be the woman who trusted blindly, continuing to let other people make decisions about my money and my life while I focused on keeping everyone comfortable. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been the beginning of discovering who I actually was when no one was lying to me. It had led to building something meaningful with Vanessa, to protecting affordable housing instead of maximizing profit, to helping thousands of women across the country rebuild their lives after betrayal. And now it had inspired someone else to change how they approached their work, creating a ripple effect I never could have anticipated or planned. When I walked into our house that evening, David was waiting in the kitchen with takeout from Romano's, the restaurant where his affair with Vanessa had begun 7 years earlier. "Special occasion?" I asked. "Anniversary," he said. 7 years ago today you found that receipt in my pocket." I looked at the familiar containers from the restaurant that had once represented the worst betrayal of my life and realized they now represented something entirely different. "Are we celebrating or mourning?" "I'm celebrating the day my wife discovered she was powerful enough to rebuild her entire life from scratch." "What are you doing?" I thought about Sandra Walsh leaving Sterling Development to start her own company focused on inclusive development. I thought about Jennifer Rodriguez working as a housing rights attorney. I thought about Vanessa leading national programs to help women recover from financial abuse. I thought about the thousands of women who'd been helped by resource centers that existed because David had lied to me and I'd refused to accept living with that deception. "I'm grateful," I said finally, for discovering that the woman who thought she needed to be protected was actually the woman everyone else needed protection from. "What do you mean?" I opened the takeout containers, thinking about how to explain what I'd learned about power and responsibility, and the unexpected ways that terrible experiences can become the foundation for meaningful work. "I mean that the pathetic housewife your mistress was mocking turned out to be someone who owned the building where you conducted your affair, who could evict you both, who could build something more important than either of you understood was possible. And now she's someone who's helping women across the country understand that being deceived doesn't define them, but how they respond to being deceived absolutely can." David smiled, and I could see in his expression the man he'd become through his own process of facing consequences and learning to be worthy of trust. "I love who you became when you stopped letting me lie to you. I love who you became when you stopped lying." As we ate dinner together, I thought about the strange journey that had led from finding that receipt to sitting in our kitchen 7 years later, both of us transformed by the crisis that had almost destroyed us. The woman who'd found that receipt had been financially comfortable but financially powerless, trusting but not discerning, focused on everyone's happiness except her own protection. The woman eating takeout from Romano's 7 years later owned a real estate empire, directed national programs to help women recover from betrayal, and had learned that real power wasn't about having money, but about using money to create the kind of world she wanted to live in. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the thing that teaches you who you really were all along. Sometimes the pathetic housewife turns out to be the most dangerous person in the room. Sometimes the love nest becomes the foundation for something more powerful than love. And sometimes discovering that someone has been lying to you is the first step toward discovering who you are when no one is lying to you anymore. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.